Here's what I'm thinking. It's a slightly exaggerated statement. The first thing is computer programming, beyond the simple things, can be really hard work. And a lot of it is about thinking about a problem and understanding the problem and understanding the difficulties in the problem. And part of it is a question of architecture. Part of it is the consequences of making a decision or making an assumption. What are the consequences of this decision or this assumption? Einstein was a very good inspector of patents. It was called a patent clerk when he worked in the patent office in Geneva, I think it was, or Bern, I think it must have been, because his knowledge of physics allowed him to see immediately the consequences, the physical consequences of a design decision in an object subject to patent. And that's a question of abstract thinking. It's not a question of understanding the diagram, if you like. So here's the radical statement, which is that programming computers is difficult. There's a book called Mythical Man Month, all about programming computers and the experience of building an operating system. And Nelson is nodding his head because he knows how important that book is. And one of the things that was done was that every week or every day, an up-to-date copy of the documentation for everything was available to the programmers. And that was a tremendously expensive but very important innovation. And the documentation meant printed documentation, because there was no before. So the statement I'm coming to think of is that in terms of abstract thinking, there's no enormous difference between blind people and sighted people, capability of abstract thought. And in some ways, perhaps blind people have the advantage because they have more imagination. You have to have more imagination if you're going to read a novel than if you're going to watch a film. There is a big difference, which is that sighted people and blind people all find computer programming difficult. The sighted people who were there first had all sorts of other advantages. They're the majority. They've had all the adaptations made that they need, or at least they've had a lot of adaptations made. And right now I'm sitting in front of a 40-inch monitor. That's a brilliant adaptation for my absence of short-term memory. I can put everything in front of me. I can have 3 or 4 pages spread out in front of it. Whereas the adaptations needed for blind people haven't, by and large, been made.
Yes.
That's a general idea, and it's probably a wrong idea as a general idea, but it might have some useful applications. And to go to the ANSI thing, the ANSI escape sequences that produce the blue text and the white text and so forth, and also control the cursor and do all sorts of other things, they were developed by sighted programmers so that their primitive displays could do fantastic things. And color was introduced to that because color is so useful to sighted people. It tells you where to look. You know, here's the important thing and here's the context. So this was prompted by you're talk about short-term memory and use of memory. And in terms of user interface, there's something called cognitive burden. It exists in all sorts of situations. And by and large, when you increase the cognitive burden, errors occur. And reducing the cognitive burden reduces errors. And that's quite important if 1 million people or 20 million people or 200 million people are filling in tax forms. If there's a cognitive burden on the tax form, then the tax forms will be filled in wrong, and that's expensive for everybody. So you have an additional cognitive burden through your absence of sight. But we can look at that burden and try and reduce it. And that's an adaptation similar to the adaptations that were made during the Mythical Man Month and so forth. So that's a sort of way of thinking that might be useful, that's coming more from my experience of user interface and usability experience than anything else.
Yeah.
But so I'll stop there because I think I've actually made my point.